People will just show up.
Yeah, for sure. Hopefully we don't have any of that.
I was surprised. I had one yesterday with Comic Show, and people we had like 14 or 15 just show up out of the blue, so it was nice.
Yeah, there you go. Can't go wrong with that, man.
Boom, we are live.
We are live at last. All right. So should we give it maybe a minute for people to show up, or do you think we should get rolling?
It's your show, my bro. It's up to you.
I guess we'll give it a minute. Sometimes it takes a second. Hopefully people pop in, and then if not, we'll just get rolling and people can watch it on the playback. No skin off my back. But yeah, dude, I've been cramming so much Marvel for the interview and everything. Like, there you go.
That's good.
Got Omnibuys, obviously some classics.
Oh man, yeah. You gotta, yeah. Well, it's good. You gotta prep for that interview, and I certainly wish you luck. So
thanks, dude. I appreciate it. I'm gonna need it. See, I don't think they're gonna ask me anything specific, but I'm kind of hoping that by like drowning myself in all this extra Marvel content, that maybe like I will subconsciously say something that sounds really smart just by nature. We got some Okie dude in the chat. He said, it is the dynamic duo. The dynamic duo we are indeed. Nice of you to join us, my friend. We appreciate it.
Yeah, Samoki dude. Hey, buddy. Hello, Samoki dude. Jace.
Yes. What interview, Jace? I am interviewing for an editor's assistant position at Marvel on Wednesday. Had a phone interview a week ago, and we're doing a final up at the offices on the Avenue of Americas in NYC. So should be interesting. I'm very excited to get this down, and I'm anxious to try and prove myself. Less nervous than I am. Like, I just want to do it. Like, I'm just ready for it. So yeah, should be a good time.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jace. I appreciate it. I need people to pull for me. That's the energy I need to be drinking off of. And some Okie dude asking the biggest question of the night: what are we drinking? Cider?
Vanilla. Crown Royal Vanilla.
They should sponsor you, man. You got to get big just so that they can sponsor you.
And I already yesterday I already drank some Corona because I feel sorry for Corona, because we all heard the bad jokes about Corona not causing the coronavirus. I supported Corona, so I'm single-handedly trying to keep the Mexican beer afloat through my purchases of Corona, but I'm not drinking Corona this evening, although I probably should.
Here's to that. I respect it. I myself have concocted an Irish coffee with some lovely Swedish coffee, Jameson, and Bailey's. So I am simultaneously trying to wake myself up and drink myself into a coma. But with all that out of the way, we have some wonderful people in the chat.
Okay, slow.
I guess we can get into it.
Sorry about that. My daughter is playing her own soundtrack in the background. I politely asked her to. My wife is helping out.
No, it
should be quiet now.
It's all good, man. I never mind the tangential appearances of the little boom. So
yeah,
let's get rolling. Hey guys, welcome to the 31st episode of Let's Talk Comics, where myself and another co-host in the comic book community discuss one of the many facets of this medium. Whether it's stories, creators, constructs, or adaptations, we hit it all. This week, I am joined by my friend, the Canadian Caped Crusader, ComicBoom. Thank you, my friend, for hopping on with us. How are you?
I'm great. It's been a great week. It's been a good week. It's been an adventurous week, and I'm looking forward to this. And like you said, we're both drinking. We're having a good time. Let's talk some comics.
Yeah. So real quick, you want to just let everybody know, for the playback who might not, what are you all about? What's your channel all about, and what do you got coming up?
What I got, my YouTube name is ComicBoom, and I got my My channel is ComicBoom with an exclamation mark. Check it out. I review mostly DC, and I rant and I rave, and I'm fairly opinionated, and it is what it is. What I got coming up is I got reviews of various DC comics from maybe complaining about Bendis to not complaining so much about Bendis, to Williamson, to Flash, to the upcoming DC events. I'll be on Professor Bill Comic Book University. He's having I'm defending Carol Danvers in Civil War II against the narcissist asshole Tony Stark. I'll be doing that tomorrow, but it's gonna be videotaped tomorrow, but it's probably gonna be prepped. It probably won't be going live until sometime next week. So I got that coming up, so it should be a lot of fun.
Awesome. Yeah, you guys make sure to tune in. Make sure you go check Comic Boom out if you, for some reason, haven't already. The link is in the description below to his
Carol Danvers, man. She rules.
So yeah, make sure you guys go check him out. One of the best comic book content creators on the interwebs. So, of course, you can also support the channel below by subscribing to myself as well. And we do have an open tip link. So if you want to contribute directly to the channel so that we can upgrade materials, technology, keep everything rolling, you're more than welcome to. And very soon we will have merch. Yes. Dark Knight Nation merch. So we're getting that ball rolling, just testing out a couple different things, and that'll be available to you guys fairly shortly. And I have a Strange Adventures numeral uno review coming at you probably by tomorrow. So with all of those shenanigans out of the way, today we are talking the tabooed comic book reboot, which seems to be one of the most divisive topics in all of comic books. Some people love them, some people hate them. Usually kind of the demise of old fans, and can sometimes contribute to the birth of new ones. But Comic Boom, you have been reading comics, and I don't want to age you up here longer than I've been alive. So you've gone through pretty much every major comic book. Actually, you've probably gone through every comic book reboot. Can you explain to the new fan out there who might be watching this video what exactly is a reboot?
Well, all right. Now, in full disclosure here, I want to be fair to people, because this is where people can get so tied up in language. And if we get too specific into the nuances of it, I'm sure perhaps even you and I can agree to disagree on the differences between a reboot, a retcon, and a revamp. I mean, the three R's, it's not reading, writing, and arithmetic in comic books. It's reboot, revamp, and retcon. What the hell do they all mean? Well, here's how I've always viewed it. I've always viewed a reboot as starting over. That's how I oversimplified in my head. A reboot is starting over. A revamp and a revamp or a retcon, I think of not starting over, just reinterpreting and reimagining an origin of that character in the same continuity, just upgrading it a bit or modernizing it a bit, because you're moving the timeline. So, for example, an example of a retcon, continuing retcons, is what I see as happening in the Marvel Universe. The Marvel Universe brags about having one timeline, and they're really good at it. But what they do is it's a moving timeline. The origin of Spider-Man keeps getting moved forward in time as we approach new generations. We still have one timeline in the Marvel Universe, but the timeline of when the heroes originated or entered the scene, so to speak, into the public, they move the timeline. But it's not technically a reboot. They're not starting over. They're not redoing all their history. They're literally it's a retcon. It's sort of an upgrade, so to speak. It's more like an upgrade to modernize it for new readership. So to oversimplify it, a reboot is starting over. A retcon is starting anew, but not starting over.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head, man. Reboots are really just going down to the ground and rebuilding from there. Retcons, I mean, just to give an example of some famous retcons out there, Batman Year One, retcon of Batman's origin. Rather than completely overwriting everything from the ground up, basically what Frank Miller did was take his focus to a very specific part of Batman's career, reinterpret it for a little bit more of a modern age, and that's how we got Batman Year One. And really, like you had said earlier, Marvel is probably more well-known for retcons, where DC is known as, the House of Reboots, just with all of the crises and all of them trying to consolidate continuity and clean everything up. Or sometimes it is sheerly for the spectacle of a reboot because it gets people on for new number ones. So obviously, for Marvel, especially regarding the retcon, because of their sliding time scale, pretty much everything that has ever been written has happened in continuity, unless it's been retconned. So rather than going back from the beginning and pretty much changing something that will alter everything, kind of like the butterfly effect, it really isolates a very specific part of a character or a storyline and alter it. So, ComicBoom, how do you feel about reboots in general? Do you think that they have any positive impact on comics? Do you think that all they do is make the older fans run away for fear of losing everything they love about, the continuity and the story? How do you feel about reboots?
Well, how I feel about a reboot is, first of all, a reboot, first and foremost, I'm not, if I had to pick a side, I'm not a fan of reboots, because the moment you say reboot, I automatically think that there's something that you think has utterly failed about what you've done before. Because if what you've done before is any good, if the characters are any good, in fact, I'll say this, and this is a little bit paradoxical, but if the characters are so good that you want to reboot them and start over, well, then clearly they must have some degree of popularity. Why would you need to reboot them? Why not simply retcon them? Now, having said that, if you've written the characters so badly into a corner that you've made them, and you've destroyed them in popular culture, then I can see maybe a reboot. But that's never really happened, quite frankly. To me, a good writer, and this is where I just want to quickly add that sometimes I think that the controversy over reboot versus retcons, I still say, and I know I sound like a broken record, and you say this all the time too, if the story is good, readership will forgive everything. And even if you look at DC with their Elseworlds tales, some of their Elseworlds stories are so good, they're incorporated into their mainstream universe. So they actually retcon their mainstream universe to incorporate stories that aren't even in their continuity. So it all comes down to story. But I don't want to digress. You asked me a specific question. You said, well, about the reboots. I mean, I don't like reboots. I think that because I think they're a last resort. And I think that the better stories arise when you become creative. I use Jeff Johns as an example. Jeff Johns, when he approached Green Lantern, he could have said, you know what, Hal Jordan, I'm writing him off. He became Parallax. He betrayed his oath. He destroyed the universe. He destroyed the Green Lantern Corps. Look how DC destroyed this character. Oh my God, we should just reboot everything. But Jeff Johns didn't do that. He's a good writer and he was creative. And he said, you know what? There's a good story here. I can take this mess and I can make a masterpiece out of it. And that's exactly what he did. He was inspired. And instead of looking at the mess that was Hal Jordan and the Parallax fiasco, and he looked at it and he saw potential and he saw inspiration, and he crafted a masterful story. And can you imagine a Green Lantern mythology right now without the influence of Jeff Johns, which really its origins began with his revamping the Parallax story. And even, I mean, the masterful idea, the gray hair. I used to hate that Hal Jordan had gray hair. They aged him up. And for him to explain that the only reason that Hal Jordan had gray hair was that was Parallax. That was fear slowly influencing him. And so when Hal Jordan finally lost that gray, it wasn't because he was getting younger. It was because he had overcome his fear and the white streak in his hair was gone. Brilliant. Brilliant. That is working. That's avoiding the reboot, and that's retconning, and it works better. And that's why I'm not a fan of the reboot. And I would cite Jeff Johns, and I would encourage other up and coming writers to use Jeff Johns as an inspiration, and future editorials for DC and the future publishers for DC to focus on retcons, not reboots.
I think you make a really valid point. I do want to give a quick shout out to Nerdy Blurb TV joining us in the chat. What's going on, brother? It is good to see you.
Hey, Nerdy Blurb.
But no, I think you bring up very excellent points here. I think that writers who love the continuity and have been exploring it and reading it and experiencing it, I feel like at least those who end up becoming creators in the industry already have to kind of have an idea of how they themselves would rebrand or reestablish certain aspects of the universe, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I read things in the universe. What do I do? What is my first reaction if I don't think it's a good idea? I was like, okay, well, like, what would make this better? You know what I mean? What would clean this up and consolidate it immediately? And I think that with that being said, there is a way to clean it up and isolate that one problem so that we can move forward and progress from there. So for DC, I know you've kind of experienced Crisis on Infinite Earths and Crisis on Multiple Earths and 0 Hour and all of those shenanigans. Do you think stories like that generate those massive reboots, do you think they have a place?
Well, I do think they do have a place, and I think that we have to be careful to put the original Crisis on Infinite Earths in perspective. I don't think there's ever been anything quite the same since then. Yes, DC has this inclination to go from crisis to crisis, but in actual fact, DC has attempted to explain within one continuity all the crises. All the crises can theoretically fit. It's messy. It's very messy, but they theoretically fit into one long narrative. Again, the narrative is messy and it's riddled with inconsistencies, but I would argue that so is Marvel. What I think is important, very important, is that you have to, as a publisher, as a comic book publisher, you have to have confidence in the narrative and not let yourself get drowned out by the inconsistencies. And I would use One More Day at Marvel as an example. Guess what? Undoing the wedding of Mary Jane and Peter Parker, that was a continuous disaster. It doesn't actually fit perfectly into Marvel continuity. There's so many kinds of plot holes that created by undoing that wedding that are still unexplained. But what I admire about Marvel is that they're saying, look, we don't care. We're leaving it up to the reader to imagine how it all works out. The wedding never happened. Now we're back to a single Peter Parker. Let's move along. And I think that's brilliant because whether we're talking about reboots or retcons, Dark Knight, I would argue that it's important to be consistent, but nobody expects perfection. It's impossible to be perfect. You're never going to have perfect continuity. You're never going to have that. Even if you have a continuity editor, there's always going to be mistakes. And so while you don't need to be beholden to continuity, you should at least respect it, but don't be owned by it. Don't be afraid to deviate from it. And I really do think that Marvel, and I'm a DC guy, but I respect Marvel for saying, look, we're one timeline. Marvel says, look, every now and then it's going to be messy. Sorry, guys, but we're going to do it if we feel that the fans want it. And if you don't like it, you'll get over it. I think that's important.
No, yeah, I think you make a really good point there again. And I agree, you know, as somebody who, I mean, I picked up reading comics during the New 52. And I think the reason why, you know, the comics that I followed felt easier to latch onto was because of that sense of history and continuity. And I think that's kind of what the reboot gets away from, you know, like my first book in the New 52 was Batman. Almost nothing was deleted. Most things were kind of consolidated. And if things were changed, they were very kind of exterior changes. You know what I mean? They weren't really large alterations to the continuity besides that bullshit that Tim Drake was never Robin because he was, and
yeah,
that was dumb.
Yeah.
But the core of Bruce Wayne's history and continuity was there, and everything that made him Batman was there. Same with Hal Jordan, just because, you know, the continuity god Jeff Johns was still in the book, and they probably didn't want to defy our Lord and Savior at that time. But those comics felt easier for me to latch onto. But it's odd because I noticed that a lot of my peers or people who start reading around the same time as me get really intimidated by continuity, which I feel like I kind of responded to that very differently. Like, I was very excited to go back and just read this massive library of stories, although at times it can get a little bit confusing, you know, trying to figure out how things line up. But, you know, there was something for me about going back and reading like Grant Morrison's Batman and seeing how we got to point B, and then starting Scott Snyder's Batman and reading that through and feeling like, you know, feeling like there is a real history and a legacy to the character, beyond just kind of the tangential iconicism that comes with, you know, him being around in the public eye for so long. So my question for you is, do you think reboots are ever effective in establishing new fan bases? Do they have a purpose in that sense to making the industry accessible? Because I think that, you know, the comic book industry is one that is desperately in need of new readership. Yeah. I don't think people are picking up comic books. New people are picking up comic books at the same rate that older fans are dropping off of the industry, you know, just for a number of reasons, whether it be entitlement or dissatisfaction in general.
Yep.
So, like, how do you feel like these massive continuities between, you know, Marvel and DC can make new fans feel welcome while appeasing, you know, the old school fans? Because for all intents and purposes, you know, even though I started in the New 52, I went back, did all of that reading, and now I feel like I am one of those older fans. But because I came in on something like the New 52, I can also acknowledge the need to make these things accessible, because not all people are like me in the sense that that massive back catalog gets you excited.
Let me ask you this. You came in at the New 52. Just give me a yes/no answer to what I'm about to ask. Did you like DC Rebirth?
I loved it.
Okay, fine. Now, there you have it. Let's talk about DC New 52, because that is a prime example of what you're talking about. DC said, and this was all under Dan Didio, okay? And I don't care if I'm going to pick on Dan Didio. If people don't like it, that's all right. You can criticize me. I'm a fan of Carol Danvers. That's all right. So she did nothing wrong in Civil War 2, by the way. So in any event, let's be blunt here. The New 52 was exactly was basically DC said it wasn't a reboot. Okay. And by the way, this is another mistake that publishing companies made. DC said the New 52 wasn't a reboot, and it was.
Yeah.
It was. They abandoned the characters. They abandoned the sensibilities of the characters. They abandoned the tone. They abandoned everything. It was, for all intents and purposes, a reboot. They ignored the continuity. They told the writers to ignore the continuity. They told the writers to ignore happy families, happy relationships, to avoid weddings, to avoid gay weddings, to avoid Batman being happy. This was a reboot of character. This was a reboot of tone. This was starting over from scratch. That's why the New 52 failed. Now, I want to be clear on this. This is so important, because the counter argument is, but ComicBoom, the New 52 was so financially successful. And people forget that at no time have comic books been more successfully advertised than how DC marketed the New 52. People forget that when you went to a movie in 2010 through 2011, you saw advertisements for DC comic books at the movie theater. They were pushing the New 52. They were pushing the New 52 with the new wardrobe and the flash collar for Superman and Batman and the Jim Lee styles. This was epic. You've never seen, and we will never see again, maybe, cross my fingers, I don't know, that level of advertising for a comic book push ever. Mm-hmm. And so when New 52 came out, is it surprising that comic book shops were so excited and people went to comic book shops for the first time? Yes. I would argue that they never went because it was a reboot. And in fact, I would argue that many of the storylines were more complicated than if they would have just followed through. I mean, the Hawk and Dove series, the Hawkman, and some of the other ones, some of the other nonsense titles that they came out with. Good grief, they were riddled with. I thought they were riddled with. There was no rhyme or reason. It was throwing shit at a wall to seeing what would stick, and then it just took 2 or 3 years for all the fans to realize that they didn't know what the hell was going on, and they just slowly dropped away. That's what happened. So I don't share, and I will argue with anybody who says that the New 52 was this grand all be all. Now, I say that mindful of the fact that I'm thankful that it got new fans like you back into DC. But how do you explain Dark Knight? And I'm gonna ask you specifically. Okay, if a reboot's so good, which I argue the New 52 was, I don't care what DC says, yet you love DC Rebirth. And DC Rebirth was a return to a past tone, a past continuity. That's what Rebirth was. And yet you loved it, and you loved it. How do you explain that?
Well, I think one of the things is that Rebirth, like the process of watching Jeff Johns reintroduce Wally West, reestablish Superman as, you know, the blue Boy Scout, like the father of the DC universe, essentially, wouldn't have been possible, and it wouldn't have been impactful without the New 52. So it's like, and let me put it in terms. I'm a Patriots fan. You come to a point where obviously the Super Bowls are just these big grandiose things. But when we're in the Super Bowl every year, they start feeling less important. I mean, let's be completely real. You look at sales before Rebirth, or I'm sorry, before the New 52, they were really floundering around. DC was really floundering around because it felt like they were just going on at the end of their rope. So yes, New 52 did some things that were totally non-preferable. But as Jace says in the comments here, you know, it was a driving force for lowering the barrier of entry for new readers. But on top of that, I think it kind of gave people more of an appreciation for the legacy and for the history of the DC universe, because I don't think, especially as a new fan and as somebody who went back and did my research and dug into continuity, I don't think I would have appreciated Rebirth anywhere near as much without the New 52. Not to mention, you just put these big universe-altering stories in the hands of competent people. Well, they go and they make it all worth it. I mean, the fact that Jeff Johns goes and he's like, this terrible thing we are acknowledging that happened to the love and the relationships and the bond and the continuity of the DC universe has a story reason now. Even though it didn't back then, Jeff Johns somehow gave it a story reason. So I think that the New 52, in a way, did a lot of very good things. We got a lot of very new perspectives on characters. You know, it gave other characters a little bit more of a spotlight in the main line. Although ultimately, yes, it did flounder, but comic books, no matter what initiative you want to talk about, whether it be big, small, reboot, retcon, new story, they don't have longevity anyways. There is no longevity in initiatives in comics ever. So I think that I value the New 52 not only because there are some diamonds in that rough, but because we got Rebirth out of it. Because it made me, as a DC Universe fan, reappreciate the legacy of DC Comics. Because if I had popped in, and by the time I popped in, say Batman was now on issue 785, because it stopped on like 713 before they did the New 52. It would have just felt like I was reading something at the end of its rope, you know? But now that I've had that opportunity to, it's like, what's that phrase? That's like, I forget the phrase, but it's basically like when you're apart from something, you almost love it even more.
Absence makes the heart grow fonder.
Yeah, that's it. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. Yeah. And like I said, I'm not saying the New 52 was perfect. There was a lot of garbage, and they really messed with a lot of characters. But can you truly say, anybody in this chat, that they would have appreciated anything along the lines of Rebirth? tonally, thematically, not even specifically plot-wise, but anything in that nature, would you have appreciated it and the legacy of the DC universe nearly as much if DC didn't reboot? And I'm not validating everything the New 52 did, but I think that it does have a purpose now, looking back on it in retrospect.
Yeah. Well, no, you're right though. The 52 did have a purpose, and it made me realize that. And I just want to make a comment to Nerdy Blurb TV. He says I can't follow the 52 failed. The New 52 failed due to not bringing more people in? Question mark. I wasn't saying that. The New 52 brought in a lot of people, and that was a good thing. It brought a lot of people into Marvel as well, ironically enough. I'm just saying that eventually the people came in and they did stay for Rebirth, and so that was a good thing. So maybe in the long run, the New 52 worked. What I find interesting in the context of our discussion about reboot versus a retcon is that all the reboots that DC has had, if you want to call them that, all the crises, isn't it interesting that DC is trying to retcon all the reboots? So you want to talk about getting tied up in language? DC now, I mean, even with Bendis's Young Justice explaining that there are 7 crises, DC is actually making all the reboots a plot point in their continuity. So DC is actually trying to explain all the reboots in one continuous continuity, and that I find kind of interesting. So and I don't even know. I mean, I don't even know if that's a wise thing to do, but DC is now trying to satisfy the lovers of the New 52, the lovers of Rebirth, the lovers of the Silver Age, the lovers of the Golden Age, the lovers of the pre-Flashpoint universe, the lovers of the post-original Crisis, the lovers of the pre-original Crisis. They're trying to incorporate all of that in 5G. They want to have one continuous storyline. So it's interesting that in our discussion right now, we're talking about reboots and retcons. And DC, at least with 5G, in theory, is trying to incorporate all the reboots and all the retcons, whatever you want to call it. They're trying to incorporate them all in one continuous through line. And so in that respect, I can admire, maybe, could we admire DC for trying to get the best of all worlds and satisfy everybody at once and saying, well, whether you guys call it a retcon or a reboot, we're not going to argue with you, but we got 5G, and just whatever your favorite hero is, there it is. Just throw it on the 5G timeline and enjoy our comic books. So go ahead.
Well, I mean, that's kind of the beauty of it, is that because the DC universe is so involved with these multiverse altering events, it almost becomes a part of the broader narrative. Like, I actually really enjoy the idea that there are these cosmic forces that are altering what we know to be the DC universe itself, and that now that we can look back at everything in retrospect, it tailors itself in and is kind of weaved into this big overarching beast that is, the DC timeline. I like that idea. I agree with you in the sense that I don't think a reboot is necessarily the best way to go, because it feels like you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think obviously just a well-planned retcon makes sense. And I'm wondering if DC wanted to go back and say they made the New 52 a large-scale retcon instead of a full reboot. Say they're like, okay, for these next couple of years, we're going to go back into the early history of these characters. We're going to modernize them. We're going to do all these things. I think, just to interject too with that, if they had done that, do you think Rebirth would have had the same weight it had? But also, do you think that there would have been a place for doing something like that, for trying to make that early readership, or trying to make that early continuity establish new readership?
Well, I think there absolutely is a place for that. I do. And I think that they started off, they had the right idea with Rebirth, with that Rebirth one shot. And for whatever reason, it seemed to get derailed. And you and I have discussed this a lot. And just a quick point about, I've often been a little bit hard on Scott Snyder's metal, because I always look to metal by saying that we had DC Rebirth one shot come out. It was phenomenally successful. And the turning point I often look at is Scott Snyder's metal, where DC decided to go dark, and they stayed dark. And now we're in the year of the villain, and now we're going to get death metal. And you've made, I will give you credit in our discussions, you've made me reconsider how harsh I've been on metal. And I didn't even mind metal as a story per se, but I would agree with you, because you did make the point before that Scott Snyder's metal was not necessarily anti-Rebirth. It was, it was just dark, but you can have dark stories in a Rebirth tonality. So you can still have that. So you can still have to me, Rebirth is about the tone and the approach to the characters with a sense of hope as opposed to a sense of cynicism. You can still embrace family and love without having to avoid it like the plague, like putting an editorial dictate down that says Batman can't be happy, or Batman can't marry Catwoman, or Batwoman can't marry Maggie Sawyer. You can still have that. Bear in mind, that's what the New 52 did. The New 52 went too far. It went beyond... I think it to me, the New 52, it went beyond simply, it was harsh. And I think the advantage with Rebirth, and I think the importance of it is, and to focus on your point, the retconning is so important. A retcon allows for creativity without destroying the substance of the characters. You can still have the foundations of the characters and just give them a little bit of a twist. And that's what I love about it. You can still go back and re-explain a character's behavior and for a new modern audience without destroying the integrity of that history. And I have to say, and we see this so often, and unfortunately we're really seeing it with Brian Bendis. And I'm going to pick on Bendis because he's a prime example of what not to do if you're a publisher. Bendis doesn't know DC history. So right now, Bendis is not retconning. Bendis is actually disregarding history. He's disregarding character history. He's disregarding fan service. He's disregarding it. He's not incorporating it. He's disregarding it, and he is, in fact, I would argue, rebooting, but saying that he isn't. It's like sucking somebody and saying, I'm blowing you. No, just doesn't work. You can't suck and blow at the same time. You know what I mean? It's like me sipping my drink saying I'm not really sipping my drink. You can see me drinking my alcohol. You can see me getting drunk, but I'm not really drunk. Guess what? People can see you. People can read. When you say you're not going to do something, but you do it, people aren't stupid. Readers aren't stupid. And that's what I find so frustrating about where DC's at right now, is that they're lying. They're in their advertising. They're saying, look what we're doing. And they're saying that, we're focusing on character and we're focusing on telling good stories. Yeah, but you're trying to change fundamentally the history. You're ignoring the tone of Rebirth. You're changing the history, but you're saying you're not. And you're not being honest with the readership. And therefore you're being inconsistent. And, and by the way, it's no coincidence that DC is avoiding using the terms retcon and reboot like the plague.
Yeah. And I like tying it into Bendis and what you were saying earlier. Maverick MX says it's free real estate, quoting Bendis. And the thing is, and I know Maverick is doing this, to kind of make fun of Bendis because it is entirely bullshit. It feels more like eminent domain. He's like, I see you've got this valuable property here, and I see that it means a lot to you, but I'm going to totally undervalue it, and you're going to get the fuck out because I would like to build a new pharmaceutical company. But actually, my pharmaceutical company will produce nothing but fucking sugar pills. Yeah. And that's essentially what it feels like. I think the issue in general is no matter what you're going to do, whether it's a reboot or a retcon, there needs to be a creator in charge of it to lead the architecture of it that not only cares, but knows how to craft story and knows the prior history. In order to change history, you have to know history. You have to be familiar with it. And that's why you have guys like Jeff Johns going out there and resculpting the DC universe and literally polishing turds. Jeff Johns is the only person besides maybe Grant Morrison, that I've ever seen in comics to literally take turds and polish them.
Yeah.
Like into gold. And I think that comics to a degree do need to change. They need to stay open to modern perspective, right? Like for me, I think that I have I'm getting better at it, but I used to have an exceedingly difficult time reading Silver and Golden Age and even some Bronze Age stories because it just feels outdated. The style of storytelling feels outdated. The level of craft feels outdated. The perspective that they're bringing, like as a reflection of the world around them, felt outdated. And so with that, I think that we do need to remodernize parts of these characters. I've always been a huge proponent, just to give a specific example, especially after seeing how Snyder did it in Parts of Metal. It's like, I would kill for Scott Snyder to go back and do his modern interpretation of Golden Age stories with guys like Yannick Paquette, like just as like an anthology type of thing, just so that new readers can go and have something to sink their teeth into, right? Because there's the first thing you want to do as a new comic book fan is like, what do you need? I need origin. I need early career to get a feel for this character. Then I can move forward. I mean, for me, even like the reading that I've had of Daredevil, I've read a lot of Daredevil in bits and pieces, but I told myself, like, I'm literally going back to Stan Lee Daredevil so that I can read forward and get a sense of how some of these changes in the character's continuity have become so important based on what they're changing, what has come before it, right? I can appreciate the fact that, for example, Frank Miller developed Stick as a means to train Matt Murdock, where in earlier continuity, he was blind and suddenly he was a fucking ninja.
Yeah.
So I think that is super, super, super important. And I think I am more of a proponent of retcons, because I think that you can start doing broader retcons, and under the right person, they can have the positive impact that these publishers, for some reason, feel like only a reboot can have.
Well, and what just to add to that, and I know that you have aspirations to be a writer, and I've always said that I think you should hire. I have a bias in favor. I think comic book publishing companies should hire writers who have a background reading comics, because having a background and a knowledge of the characters is absolutely crucial to come up with story ideas. For example, you gave an excellent example of Daredevil. So let's dumb that down. Let's break that down. Let's say you want to write Daredevil, and you've always thought you love the origin of Daredevil, you love the character, but you've always thought it was really odd that suddenly this young kid gets these radar sense powers and suddenly he knows how to fight. Well, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, yeah, sure, you got radar sense, but why would you know how to fight? Well, Frank Miller said to himself, well, you know what? That doesn't make any sense. So why don't we introduce Stick? Why don't we, so in other words, you can retcon, you can add to the mythology instead of start over.
Yeah.
You add to the richness of us. And the only way that you can add to the richness of a character is if you're familiar with the character. And what's so frustrating about new writers, and even the big name writers, hello, Bendis, they're not familiar enough. And I know Bendis read a bunch of comic books while sitting on a hospital bed recovering from an illness that he almost died from. And I'm glad he's healthier and everything else, but you didn't read enough. You spent the last 17 years at Marvel, and it shows. It really shows. And I got to tell you, man, it's not working. I'm not feeling it. And and again, I guess I'm picking on Bendis, but it just goes to show you that some ideas work, some ideas don't. And it's no surprise that Bendis's best work at DC is with Legion of Superheroes, where there is more real estate, as Maverick said, and more free real estate to do what you want, because people are less beholden to the continuity of the Legion because they've been rebooted so many times. Right. But in any event, yeah, familiarity with the source material is so important, because it leads to better stories, and the best examples of that are Jeff Johns and Donny Cates at Marvel.
I agree. I totally agree with you. And you know, it's such a fine balance. And I think finding the people that are capable of achieving that balance is something that publishers are not paying enough attention to. I don't think they're putting in the proper effort to find those people, because it's not easy. I mean, we're sitting here and talking about it and criticizing it, but it is not easy, because you are simultaneously trying to please people who have developed an image of these characters and the tone of the world over decades of loving them, but also you want to make it accessible enough for idiots like me to hop in on this continuity. And it's not an easy thing. But I think the issue is that it feels like comic book publishers, namely DC, because of their, I don't even want to say a tendency to reboot, because it's not like they do it a hell of a lot, but their willingness to reboot is almost laziness. You know what I mean? Like, I commend them for developing this massive timeline of the DC universe and trying to reinterpret those stories and those parts of continuity for those different times in comic book history. It takes a lot more work, but at the end of the day, I think you're going to have something a little bit more sustainable. And if it's going to show anything, none of these reboots and the brief line of continuity that comes as a result of these reboots have held any real longevity at all. Comic books are not something that have generated longevity and continuity, and longevity in sales, unfortunately. But I think that, and we've brought this up, kind of attacking it from other angles in various conversations. But the issue is that these publishers are afraid to make the slow build up to the top. You know, it's going to take more time. It's going to take more resources, and you might not sell as much at first. But if you build a sturdy base and you move from the ground up, eventually you will have a skyscraper.
And I just want to interrupt you quick and give a shout out to, and I always say it wrong because I'm the guy that always mispronounces things, but Valiant Comics.
Valiant, yeah.
Valiant. They're fantastic. They're a prime example of a publishing company that's building their universe, and they're they don't reboot. They might reinterpret. They're always adding to their mythology, and they do a fantastic job. And I collect a lot of Valiant. Great comic book company, great characters.
Yeah, I mean, I've read a couple of small things. I got into like Venditti's Expo Manowar, but you know the thing that really gets me is, and maybe I'm just too much of a fan, is I would think that these publishers would want to invest in longevity, right? Like, you would think that they'd be able to sit down and kind of reassess, okay, throughout the 80 years that we've been publishing these books, what are the things that old fans, that these legacy fans seem to be fond of? What keeps them reading? And what are the things that we've done that might have lost them but brought in new fans? Now, in those initiatives, in those massive changes, what are the parts about that old fans didn't like? And what are the parts about that new fans did like? And how can we kind of polymerize that to what pleases old fans? And you're never going to make everybody happy, because we, and I'm speaking generally as a group of comic book fans, can be pretty entitled to our images of characters.
Yeah.
But
sorry.
No, I just think that there needs to be, I think DC in particular really needs to take a step back and reevaluate those things, because it doesn't feel to me, especially now that I've been established as a little bit more of an older fan, that there's any real incentive for new fans to jump in. Like, I feel like I constantly am recommending the same old things to new people trying to get into comics. And we've also talked about, and I'll bring this up, you've also brought up in many discussions how we're not really generating many evergreen stories nowadays. It just doesn't happen anymore. Yeah. It's very, very rare.
Well, you can't. How do you generate an evergreen story when you got a Justice League arc like Snyder, 39 issues long? I mean, focus your story, man. I mean, it shouldn't be longer than 6 to 12 issues. I mean, focus your narrative, and it might be challenging, but you're writing Justice League now. This is your A game. This is your dream project, man. Focus your thoughts. Get it together. Like, I mean, and maybe I'm being hard, but I'm a comic fan, and this is what I expect. And we want more people in the medium. You know, Tom King, 100 issues, even 85 issues. What are you kidding me? Get your head out of your ass. You shouldn't have 85 issues to tell a Batman story, man. Focus your thoughts. Make your point faster than that. And how can I honestly, seriously, you walked up to a guy on the street and he says, I heard about this Tom King Batman story. Could you in good faith, if you had any conscience at all, would you say to him, oh, by all means, buy the 17 or whatever trades to read Tom King's Batman? Are you kidding? I mean, what is that? Like a $90, $100, $300, $400 commitment? Give it a break.
I mean, on account of I don't like it, I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah, I know, but I'm just saying that even if you did like it, even if you liked it, you're saying to someone, look, you know, I mean, look, and I realize we're competing with TV and other mediums and everything else, but, you know, the challenge of a comic book and the ones that are really epic are the ones. It is possible to tell a 6 to 12 issue great comic book story. Even Tom King has written one. I mean, his Batman Annual 2 is fantastic. He can do it. Bendis is capable of writing fantastic short one-issue stories. He's done it. These guys that I bitch and whine and complain about, they're really good writers when they're in their A game. We're not getting their A game most of the time. We're getting their D to F game, and it's really starting to really annoy me. And they're not stepping up to the plate. And I really, you know, and I'm going to reference back to the comment about so much real estate there. That you have no idea how much that pisses me off about a writer would presume to have all this real estate. Look, I don't want a writer to think he's got 2 years to tell a story. I think it's so important to say to a writer, look, we'll give you 24 issues, but I want 12 stories, or I want at least 6 self-contained stories. Now, can you do that job? Because if you can't do that job, we'll look somewhere else. Because there's an awful lot of competition for writers and artists out there. And it's just, and there's a lot of people that would kill. I mean, there's not only people like you, Dark Knight, who are very passionate, but I think there are so many potential Jeff Johns and Sir Donny Cates out there that are just chomping at the bit to tell these stories. And, you know, yeah, anyways, rant over.
No, I mean, it's an odd duck. I mean, for me, I think that writers can still have long runs as long as they can give us bite-sized pieces. And if you want to create anything that's going to broadly overarch throughout a run, I think it should maybe be thematic. You know, you look at something like Grant Morrison's Batman, you can read Son of Batman by itself. You can read Batman Rest in Peace by itself. You can read Batman Reborn when Dick Grayson takes the cowl and Battle for the Cowl. You can read all of that stuff individually, and they're all great. But you know what's even better? If you read all the way through and you're like, wow, there's this running theme of what exactly the legacy and the mantle and the iconicism of Batman means to the DC universe, right? And then we pass that on to Dick and figure out what that means to him and how he's going to reinterpret that mantle, right? There's a running theme, but to that same degree, you could pick up at any of those points and be okay. And just read that and walk away satisfied. I mean, Batman Rest in Peace was the middle of a Black Glove storyline. It's one of my favorite Batman stories of all time. And it was one of the first Batman stories I ever read. And although, yeah, I had a couple of vague questions, none of them ruined the impact that the story had on me.
Okay. Well, let me put some pressure on you, Dark Knight. Let me ask you a question.
Okay.
All right. So, all right, you're in charge of DC Comics right now. All right. Okay. You know, Jim Lee is out. He's not doing anything anyway. He's spending another 3 years drawing a sketch, and you're in charge of DC Comics, and you've got Death Metal's coming up. All right, so straight up to you: are you rebooting? Are you retconning? What are you doing right now? How do you view the DC universe right now? And is a reboot or a retcon in its future based upon some of the things we've talked about?
Well, I would retcon. I would definitely retcon. I think rebooting, I can't in good conscience have a hard reboot of the DC universe at this point, having gone through all of those rapid changes in continuity. But I think that there is a lot of retconning to be done. And I think the nice thing is with generally how poor I feel the DC Universe mainline has been over the last 2 years, I think it almost makes it easier for me to retcon, and it's going to make it a little bit easier for the things that I want to implement to have impact, right? So obviously, one of the things that I would do majorly is reestablish Superman, because I don't think we had enough time to. I mean, the thing about Superman, and I think DiDio has even said this on multiple interviews, is that how well Superman is doing ultimately reflects the entire DCU mainline. And you look at the New 52, where does big dissatisfaction come from? It wasn't the Superman we knew. You look at DC Universe now. What has Bendis done with Superman? He's depriving Superman of humanity. He deprived Superman of his son, which watching Superman be a father was like one of the most innovative things you could have possibly done.
Yeah.
That treads new ground, but also respects the character, because it is the logical progression. What happens when the literal father of the DC universe has a son? How does he raise his son? Exactly. How does he reinterpret the values instilled upon him by Ma and Pa Kent and the rest of Earth? How does he make John a better man than him? Right? And it opens up so many different avenues to explore, not only in that way, but also, okay, like John is growing up with a superhero father.
Yeah.
Right? Like Clark Kent had to kind of move in that direction on his own.
But you nailed it, man. You nailed it. I'm having another drink just for you.
But John is influenced by so many different stimuli.
Yeah.
And it opens up so many great avenues to watch him grow. One of the, and I know Tevya, Smolka, and Telhill 29 are going to love what I'm about to say. One of the best parts about modern continuity was watching the dynamic between John Kent and Damian Wayne.
Yeah.
Because not only are we watching them grow up and experience this world built on the backs of their fathers, right, who are just titans of their universe and even ours iconically. But we're watching them kind of interpret that world and try to live up to the legacy and try to reinterpret what those legacies mean to them specifically and act on that. And for me, I would be doing a lot of work around Superman, because I think just by, for example, Batman just being a figure that everybody knows and loves, I think that you can just, if Batman's moving this way, you can just change the direction and people are cool. Like, as long as people start seeing a direction that they're interested in, they can just kind of forget what came before it. You know what I mean?
I can't articulate it as well as you just did, but I just want to add to it, because you articulated that so well, that the fact that Superman had a son, and Superman was always filled with angst as it was. Superman has always been the guy that did the right thing, but always questioned himself. He always possessed enough self-awareness to be aware of other things. And, I can't think what's so tragic about what DC has done with hiring Bendis and aging up John Kent. The dumbest thing that any publishing company has ever done, aging up John Kent. They aged him up at precisely the time when they needed to leave him young, because we live in a day and age where people disagree politically and culturally and socially. People hate each other on Twitter. They hate each other online. And yet personally, they can shake hands and drink beer in the bar. And yet we all have different identities. We have identities online. We have identities in our professional life. We have identities in our personal life. And there's an opportunity with Superman and young John Kent. You could have explored the differences in the generations between Superman and a young John Kent, learning to navigate those different social forces. The potential for stories, as you indicated, was immense and incalculable. But they just aged them up by letting some guy from Marvel come over after 17 years, disregard DC continuity, throw him on Earth 3, trap him in a volcano for 7 years, bring him back, just so you can change the continuity of the Legion of Superheroes. Appalling, inexcusable, and, well, I won't say unforgivable because I'm a nice guy. Like I said, this can all be retconned. It can all be retconned. And by the way, a simple retcon here, if I was publisher, the simplest retcon in the world is the source wall broke down. It led to the paradox that created the aging up of John Kent. Simple. Have the source wall go back up. Paradox created. You have older John Kent in the 31st century, and you have a new young John Kent return to the 21st century. Problem solved. It's really simple. It's really simple. There was no reason to age up John Kent. If you want an older John Kent in the 31st century, then have one in the older John Kent in the 31st. You don't need to age up the present day John Kent to have an older one in the 31st century. It's comic books. Exercise a little bit of imagination. It drives me crazy.
Yeah, and you know what the worst part was in regards to that? There's still no justification, because when Superboy, as in Clark Kent, originally interacted with the Legion, he wasn't that old. The early days of Superboy going to the whatever century at the time of the Legion's creation,
Preacher brother,
that old. And you know what? You know what would have been really good? What would have been really good is watching a young man reconciling a future before he's old enough to really understand how we got there. And then he goes back to his continuity with those new lessons, and we watch him grow and evolve. The issue is that we start introducing things into this continuity, these gems, and we don't elaborate on them. They're hot for 2 minutes, and then we stop. Telhelm brings up the Bat family. There are so many great characters in the Bat family that get nothing. And deserve it. And you know what? You know what the beautiful thing about having those supporting characters is?
Yeah, what?
They strengthen the value of the character that they spawn from. That's what they're like. And the great thing is, when you develop them and you spend time with them, they become their own characters. Look at Nightwing. I mean, he's the embodiment of DC legacy. Look at Wally West. The issue, and for me, and going back to what you were asking me, like how I would handle it, you know what I would do? I would make Batman and Superman interact with their respective families. I would make Donna Troy become a more integral character in Wonder Woman's history and continuity. Absolutely. Because we don't explore that anymore.
Yeah.
And it also allows us to reapproach these characters in their relationships to other characters and see sides of them that we don't often get to see. And on top of that, because all of these characters are inherently different, it gives us new avenues for stories, right? We can do a crazy martial arts story with Bruce bonding with Cassandra Cain because he treats her like shit and ignores her right now. And that's not Bruce. Bruce was a fucking orphan. He wouldn't treat people like that. Yeah. He was raised by Alfred.
Yeah.
Bruce, I hate that modern thing, by the way, where people are like, yes, Bruce, if Bruce were all by his lonesome, he would roll around in it.
Yeah.
But because he has these young figures in his life, it should be important to him.
Yeah.
Like and my first thing as DC whatever executive poobah head cheese would be to reestablish Bruce's relationships with his family, explore them. I mean, I've talked to you behind the scenes. If I ever get to write Batman, I have a huge plan for an arc where you spend 2 to 3 issues, Batman reestablishing relationships with every member of the family and allowing him to grow and allowing him to figure out exactly, A, what do those characters mean to him? B, what does Batman mean to each one of them? And C, why are they important in the first place?
Yeah.
Because we don't often get reminded of that. And all we have are these fans who love these characters from years ago, just watching them fade away into nothing. It is a shame that we don't have a Robin book right now.
I hear it, and I sing it, brother. I agree with you 100%. And I just want to add, and this is decidedly my bias, and you know, I always say I'm 51, so I'm gonna, you guys can read in whatever that you want. So I'm an older comic book reader, so take that for what it's worth. And I'm getting more conservative in my old age, whatever, blah blah blah. So take that for what it's worth. So just to know my biases up front, but this is my take on things, and this is my theory. I think that we live in a world that's increasingly, and I'm leading into where I think the readership is. I think the younger readership, I think the young are they're staying single longer. I think that the young are developing strong friendships, but not strong family bonds. I think that families are breaking down more and more. There's a greater amount of single families. I think, you know, superhero comics are about wish fulfillment. I actually think that one of the wish fulfillments when people read comic books is that they will actually read a comic book where family is one of the issues because they don't have one themselves. You want to see and the problem is most of the writers don't know what a functioning family is either. And the irony is that Bendis himself has, like, what does he have? 12 kids?
No, yeah, I totally echo that.
But this is my point is that, and I'm not trying to, maybe I'm sounding like a jerk here. I'm actually trying to sound empowering to writers that remember that family is important. And just because you don't have it in your own life, or just because maybe you've had a shitty life yourself, you know, bear in mind that the people reading your comic books, they want to feel good when they're done reading it. I shouldn't want to go slit my wrists every time I read a DC comic. You know, not for an entire year of you're the villain. Remember that at the end of the day that you want to create some satisfaction to your readership, and that this is supposed to be at the end of the day about superheroes. You're supposed to aspire to something better in our personal lives, our professional lives, and about doing something good. These are metaphors. These are metaphors for who we can be. I don't read a comic book thinking when I read a great Superman comic, I'm 51 years old. Do you think I jump on my roof and I want to jump off and think I can fly? Of course not. I want a feel-good comic that makes me feel good. I've read comic books where I feel so good after I'm done reading them. I go and I kiss my daughter goodnight and I give her an extra hug. And I'm thinking about the comic I just read. That is what I'm talking about. That's the feel that used to be DC. Where's that feeling? You know, that's what I'm looking for. Family, friendship, bonds, you know, that sort of tonality. This is something that you can find and you can aspire to. And we're not reading in DC comics, and it's sad. And I got to tell you, and just as a quick note, I want to give props to Scott Snyder, and I want to give props to Brian Bendis. Brian Bendis is a strong family person. He's got a strong family bond with his family. He loves his kids. Kudos to him. He's a great person. He's personable. Scott Snyder's awesome. He loves his kid. He's posting pictures of him and his kid on fantastic, man. All the power to you. The power and love of family. Put that in your comic books, because you guys know what the importance of family is. You guys know that. And I'm not just sounding like a conservative here. I'm just saying, look, these are stories that resonate with people regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum. I'm not trying to get political. I'm just saying that these things are important. And, you know, and I think we're moving away from that. And just because society's moving away, where fewer and fewer people are getting married and more people are staying single longer, it doesn't mean that we can't aspire to these things. Okay, rant over.
Well, the issue is that I don't think DC quite realizes really how important and how impactful, you know, allowing these things, like, for example, like utilizing the Bat family, Superman kind of taking this avenue of being a father and that being the central focus, how important that is, because they are fresh ideas, and fresh ideas don't happen very much in comics, right? Like there's always the saying that not a single idea nowadays is ever going to be original. But this approach has such a wealth to expand the universe, and it feels natural. And it also allows us to generate new questions for these characters to challenge that they've never challenged before. Superman, the glory about Superman being a father and exploring that is you don't question that Superman is going to save the day. But no amount of strength, no amount of heat vision, no amount of ice breath, no amount of super speed is going to make him a good father. He makes himself a good father. And we can re-explore character on those bounds because that's what's important. Yeah. Ultimately, yes, it's cool to watch Superman push a giant rocky-looking monster through a building and get mad and laser beam the shit out of him. But that's not what we're here for. Right? Yeah. Like, we're here to be reminded what makes this character important. And it also introduces this new conflict for Superman to approach. And I don't mean that in like a battle type of way, but it is a challenge for Superman to re-explore, to explore what it means to be a father. Because in fact, even being Superman, being somebody who has assigned himself that level of responsibility makes it even more difficult to be a father.
Yeah.
And there are so many different concerns. And I think DC, for some reason, is either unaware or afraid of allowing us to move in that direction. I think the next step with whatever, like for me, again, if I were in charge, my DC 5G would literally be focusing on how these origin characters, how these massive mantles are interacting with the new generation. How are they building those relationships? What does that mean to these characters? That's how you move into the 5th generation. We reestablish how Diana is going to become whatever type of figure or role model for like Donna Troy. How is Clark raising his son? How there's so much story potential to bring back Connor and make Connor the anxious older brother of John. It establishes conflict between the two of them. It establishes direction for growth. Like, I think, again, too, the friendship between Damian and John is one of the best breeding grounds for story, because it also reapproaches all of these different questions, because Damian, by being friends with John, that gives him the potential to be the best Batman ever.
Yeah. And everything you said, I agree with 100%. And I think we're sort of, I think we're in sync in the way that we're thinking. And I think, I actually believe that any sensible person, and this is my arrogance, I do believe any sensible person listening to this would agree with us, that at least this is something that should be explored as a possibility, at a minimum on an alternate Earth or an Elseworlds tale or something. Because I still say DC Universe is not taking advantage of the multiverse. You don't need to by the way, you don't need to reboot or retcon if you got an alternate Earth. I mean, if you have a multiverse, you don't need to reboot or retcon. You can just take the story onto another Earth, and there you have it.
And the funny thing is, on that, just quickly evolving on that, is they still sell. The DC seems to think that books won't sell if they're not in mainline. Look at how well these Black Label books sell. Look at how well Earth One sold.
Yeah.
The Earth One line is one of the most successful publishing initiatives DC has had in the last 10 years. You can go tell those stories and have them matter to people.
And one of the reasons why it sells, and here's where I insult everybody's intelligence, but DC editorial or marketing department needs to be insulted, is that they have self-contained stories. They have self-contained stories, and they're well written, and people want to come back for more. And lo and behold, what's the one thing we haven't seen in a while? We haven't seen an Earth One story. We haven't seen an Earth One story. And it's really, really sad. And it makes me shake my head, and it gets so frustrating, because we've talked about the importance of the relationship between, you mentioned it, John Kent and Damian. There's no reason why that can't be developed, and that shouldn't be developed. And the sad part is that if there was any sort of synchronicity in the editorial department, I mean, I can't be the only person, and the people in the chat can back me up on this. When's the last time you heard in comic book news, Newsarama or comic book resources, when's the last time you heard about a DC summit where all the writers got together and actually coordinated their storylines or talked about the next big event? I've experienced that with Marvel, I know Marvel's done that a few times. When's the last time has DC ever done that?
I think the biggest issue with how DC's doing it, because I think they're probably doing it behind closed doors, but the biggest issue is that, you know, you get your quote unquote big name writers in there and they're like, I'm going to do this thing. And then DC's like, okay, everybody follow the leader. It totally steals these creators' agencies to develop these stories. Like, I think, okay, you know, and everybody who's watched me for an extended period of time knows that I was extremely excited for Tomasi hopping on Detective Comics. And I loved the first arc. And there was a lot of stuff from between the end of that arc to now that I thought was mediocre. And I'm really starting to believe that it's because DC isn't allowing Tomasi, because he's not a big name, to do things that are going to ultimately alter the character when they have name B over here doing it. And it creates stale stories. Like, the issue is that people again, or publishers again, are going for spectacle. They're like, oh, it doesn't matter what the story is, because if we slap this name on it, people are going to buy it anyways. Like, and in a perfect world, which clearly it's not, they would just give the person the power to alter the universe that has the better story. Like, it's not that hard. And, you know, I know a couple of guys like Tevye and Telhelm and Maverick are bringing up a lot of Tomasi. Like, yeah, like Batman and Robin was one of the best books of the New 52. His Superman was one of the best books of Rebirth. Super Sons was a blast.
And like, you know, we talked about Evergreen before, and I think Tomasi's runs on Batman and Robin and on Batman, Detective. I think those are big. They're the future evergreens. They're the ones that long term are going to have better sales than the Event Leviathans and the Legion of Superheroes. They're the ones that are going to be making DC money going into the future. And I actually think that, you know, the cream rises to the top. And I do think that inevitably we are going to get, and let's make the prediction now. Let's be bold. I think we're going to get a young Jonathan Kent at some point. We're going to get more young Jonathan Kent stories, because I think that this is not a controversy that's died down. Yeah. I get people at my comic shop talking about it, and they're still bitching about it, just like me. People are still upset that we have an aged up John Kent, and it's made worse by the bad writing of Bendis. We haven't gotten better stories with an aged up John Kent. It's stupid. Bendis is actually bragging about a meeting between Connor Kent and John Kent. Who in the hell asked for that? Anybody? Is anybody anywhere on the internet asked for John Kent meeting Connor Kent? Nobody. Connor Kent died. I didn't care when he died. Why would I care if he's back? The guy and he's still wearing that stupid looking leather jacket. In any event, it's, you know, I digress a bit, but, you know, it frustrates the hell out of me. When something works, leave it alone. When it's not broken, why are you trying to fix it?
I think to that specific sentiment, I mean, I think there's a lot of storytelling potential in looking at those different generations of super family interacting, like between John and Connor. Obviously under a much better writer, and under a writer that cares about continuity and knows about continuity, because I think that was one of the most interesting dynamics for the Bat family in the late 2000s was, for example, they literally threw like a needle into the Bat family when they put Damian in there, and you watch all of that conflict that it generates. And it might not happen to the same degree, but John and Connor are two very different characters. Yeah. And to a degree, I can't help but feel like there's a lot of potential to watch how they're going to interact, and how I think Connor would grow a lot from interacting with John, because I think Connor would have imposter syndrome big time from seeing John, because John inherently is this beacon of light in the DC universe. John is the biological son of Superman, whereas Connor Kent is a test tube bastard. And I think that particular sentiment I disagree with, because I think there's a lot of potential. And I think that in regards to like nobody asked for things, there's a lot of things that I love in the DC universe that I never asked for. So I think that I don't want to restrict it in that way, but I think like your base sentiment is entirely correct.
Yeah.
If something works, let it thrive. Feed it some fucking Miracle Grow and see what happens. Because at least you're trying something different that's charting a new course for the universe that doesn't have any predisposed negativity surrounding it. In fact, it's all positive. It is all positive. You look at the transition, for example, and I bring up Damian again. People hated Damian when he was first introduced. But you know what happened? We had some good people in there telling stories with the character, developing him, allowing him to grow, and they built a fan base around him. Like, I see a large pocket of people out there on the internet who now claim that Damian Wayne is their favorite Robin.
Yeah, well, I would just give you pushback on the one point. I loved Damian the moment he appeared. I loved Damian. I never hated Damian. I always loved him because he was a narcissistic prick, and he was. But I accepted it because he was a kid, and I expected him to be a narcissistic little bastard because he was raised by League of Assassins, Talia al Ghul, and I loved him. And I always say this. I thank Grant Morrison for introducing Damian Wayne, but it was Tomasi and Gleason that made me love Damian Wayne. Morrison made me accept Damian Wayne, but it was Tomasi and Gleason that made me love him. And because, it was funny because Morrison introduced Damian Wayne, and I never was really a fan of Grant Morrison's Batman run. Never was. I wasn't a fan of how he killed off Damian. I know that was his original plan, et cetera, and he stuck with it. I get it. But I love the fact that this powerhouse called Grant Morrison introduces a character, Damian Wayne, and he's so beloved, and he became loved because of Peter Tomasi and Patrick Gleason, that after Morrison kills him off, and Didio let Morrison kill Damian off because that was Morrison's original intention, but because we, the fans, we resurrected Damian Wayne because we loved him. He came back because we fans loved him. We loved him. And then guess what happens when we bring Bendis over? Didio then says, there you go, fans. We don't care what you say. Yeah, we're paying attention. We're going to age him up by let Bendis write this ridiculous story where he's in a volcano for 7 years on Earth 3 to age him up because he wants to tell a story about Legion of Superheroes. Why doesn't, if he wants a Superboy for the future, use Connor Kent? Why do you need to use Damian, or why do you need to use John Kent? Anyways,
that also would have been a good way to explain away where Connor's been all this time.
There you go. A little bit of creativity. You're thinking like Jeff Johns. Of course, Bendis can't think like Jeff Johns because he's not Jeff Johns.
Yeah.
How's that for logic?
There's God. I'm trying to be as honest without ranking on DC for these choices because it's really hard not to. Damian is one of those characters for me that I liked from the beginning because I knew the potential that the character had, and I knew that it was intentional. Morrison put Damian there in the beginning for Bat fans to hate. He created Damian with the sole intent to make us hate him so that he could develop some level of affection for him so that by the time he does kill Damian off, it has an emotional impact. Because you're not sticking on one, you're not kind of on one level of kind of an emotional association. It's so much more dramatic when you go from here to here and then he's dead. That drop off becomes so much more dramatic. And there's something to be said about Grant Morrison being the one to do that, because Grant Morrison largely is much more in favor of retconning old school continuity and re-adding value to that by modernizing it. And he moved it in a new direction. So I feel like just based on him taking that approach, you have to look at what value he feels like Damian is going to add to the overall continuity, right? Because someone like him, again, he's so much more concerned with adding value to what came before. But in this instance, he created something new. He created something that he felt like would have a lasting impact on the DC universe. And I think he did. So I guess, we're toting on about almost an hour and a half here. We'll go through a couple of these comments in the chat real quick and kind of re-summarize our thoughts to a conclusion. Jace says that he dislikes almost everything Morrison has done. I'm going to agree to disagree with you. I love Morrison. Morrison's Batman is part of what got me into comics. I think that it's a really beautiful thing where you can take all of these old convoluted golden and silver age concepts and reestablish them for the modern age. I think, what he did with Batmite, for example, during Batman RIP, and what he did with Batman Zero-N-R was one of the most intelligent ways to reprocess continuity.
Yeah.
And things of that nature. I love what he did with Catherine Kane, not Kate Kane Batwoman, but Catherine Kane, the original Batwoman, reestablishing her as a character who has been with far more agency, and it explains away why she's been gone for so long, why she faked her death. I mean, Morrison's not perfect. No writer is perfect. And I think that Morrison has definitely kind of lost the ability to do so as effectively as he had in the past. But largely, I think Grant Morrison has done way more good for the DC universe than bad. And I think if you look at all-time writers like all-time creators at DC Comics, I mean, you can't help but acknowledge that Grant Morrison is up there. Wherever you want to place him on that ladder is going to be up to you subjectively, but Grant Morrison, I think, is a genius.
Yeah, I would just add to that Grant Morrison. I have a love-hate relationship with Grant Morrison. He's written some really great stories. I'm not a big fan of his Final Crisis, but I have to admit that it added some interesting wrinkles to the mythology of the DC universe, and I thought he had some inspired ideas. It didn't work well on the execution, but again, I admire him. I liked his multiversity. I loved his ideas in multiversity. He's got some really interesting ideas, and he thinks outside the box. I'm even enjoying his Green Lantern. I know a lot of people are hating on his Green Lantern, but I love how he's. One thing about Morrison that I got to give him credit for, that he's really good at creating his own universe and his own way of looking at things that don't necessarily destroy the DC continuity. You can now, again, with a little bit of creativity, he can create his own way of looking at a character without destroying the integrity of Hal Jordan. He can create a Green Lantern universe and a Black Stars universe without necessarily destroying the history of the Green Lantern Corps. Yeah. By the way, there is inconsistency there in Green Lantern story. It doesn't fit quite perfectly into the emotional spectrum in Jeff Johns' universe. It doesn't. There's some hiccups. But again, I would use Marvel Universe as an example. You don't always need to fit perfectly in order to enjoy a story and enjoy what a writer's doing. Look at Grant Morrison's X-Men. Look what he did there. There's Marvel zombies that hate Grant Morrison's X-Men, but guess what? He introduced Zorn, and Zorn has been built upon as a character in the Marvel Universe repeatedly and it didn't destroy the Marvel Universe. I always say one bad writer doesn't, one divisive writer does not necessarily you can't destroy a universe with one writer. And in any event, I will end by saying about Grant Morrison that whenever I feel very emotional about a writer, whether it's Bendis or King, it also means it's also an underhanded compliment, because as much as I'm upset with Bendis, I admit that he's written some of the best stories I've ever read. Same with Tom King. He's written some great stories that I've loved, but boy, oh boy, when they write stinkers, they sure know how to piss me off.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing about Morrison is, and I think he's gone off the rail a little bit as he's gotten farther away from doing comics. I think he's kind of been out of doing comics on a frequent schedule. So I think he's kind of coming back into it with a new mindset.
Yeah.
Whereas when he was kind of ingrained in comic book culture and actively, writing on a very regular basis, I think that he generated a very different product. I don't agree with all the choices he takes, but I think the thing to focus on here is that approach, right? Whether or not, and people are bringing up how they don't like how slowly paced his books are. I agree. It might be an acquired taste, but I think that by keeping, and it's not always the case, but I think that in the stories of his that really succeed with a little bit slower pacing, I think it really ups the impact of the payoff because we've spent the time to build up to it. And then when we get there, it's just an explosion, it is truly a climax. But regardless of that, I think you have to admire his approach to comics. He tries his best to reconsolidate continuity without destroying it, without invalidating it.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I think you get the right writer in there, and maybe it's not always going to be as smart as the way Grant Morrison did it, because I think Grant Morrison made some choices that make me think, wow, I will never write anything nearly as smart as that. But I think at least evaluating how great that approach is and how that might be the key to to retaining old fans while allowing these new fans to at least get some sort of exposure to these older concepts. And the beautiful thing is, if different writers take that approach, different writers are also going to handle it differently. Just because they're moving in a general direction with a general idea doesn't mean you're not going to get their tendencies and their tone and their style interweaved with that, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of the secret to unlocking the potential of the DC universe. Taking that, playing with that old continuity, not being afraid to move in these new directions. And I think particularly, again, DC struck gold with John Kent and Damian Wayne, and allowing these old school characters to be redefined under entirely different lights.
I totally agree with you. And I actually think that, and just as a quick aside, I really think that if ever there was going to be a Netflix series or anything like that, or a side series, why not have one with a young John Kent or Damian Wayne? I think that would be a great Netflix series. I think that would be inspired, and I think would be hilarious. Can you imagine a series based on that? I mean, you have this young narcissist, because children can get away with narcissism because they're young and they're just learning the ropes. And there's something about an overskilled, overintelligent, narcissistic little bastard named Damian Wayne trying to establish a friendship with a young, doe-eyed Jonathan Kent. I mean, it cries out for more stories. And the fact that we've been deprived of that is a tragedy that I will never stop bitching about.
I mean, I think though we will get John Kent back. I feel like there's this massive feedback mechanism of fans who are crying out to get the John Kent we know and love back. So I think we'll get it. And one thing I do want to address here in your comment, Jace, is that I was a new reader when I started reading Grant Morrison's Batman. So as somebody who was reading Grant Morrison's arguably dense writing, that was my first exposure. My first Batman run was Grant Morrison. Scott Snyder pulled me into reading modern comics, but my first run was Grant Morrison. And I personally appreciated the density because it provides a sense of history for me. It makes me feel like this is really a fleshed out, lived in universe. And it makes me feel like, I can hop in at this point and I might be here, but it gives me the ability to explore in either direction, going back in time, going forward in time. So I'd have to disagree. As somebody who cut their teeth on DC Comics, reading Grant Morrison, particularly as Batman, I think that, and it'll be different. I think every new reader is going to be different.
Yeah.
Because my first comic that I ever owned, my first series I ever owned was Final Crisis. And
oh my God. I'm surprised you stayed in comic books. If that was your first comic book, oh my God.
Yeah, no, I remember seeing it and my mom had gotten it for me for Christmas one year. And I remember reading that and being like, wow.
You're in the minority, my friend. Good grief. Final Crisis was your first exposure to comics? Seriously?
Yeah.
Oh
Yeah,
my God.
because I remember reading it and I was like, wow, there's all this crazy stuff. I want to go back and figure out how we got here.
Yeah,
And
I salute you. You know what? I salute you. And let me just give a compliment to Grant Morrison, that and a compliment to you that shows it displays your passion for comics, because Grant Morrison, when he started writing Batman, he made it very clear that he had read a lot of Batman. And the one thing that Grant Morrison did that Bendis has not done, Grant Morrison said that I've read a lot of Batman comics. And what Grant Morrison did is that he incorporated all the past issues of Batman, all the craziness. He even had a storyline where he explained he had adventures with Batman, incorporating all the past crazy Silver Age adventures of Batman. He incorporated all of that. And he did it in such a way that was a psychedelic kind of play on Batman's mind, and with fighting the devil, who was I can't remember the character's name, but all that's been incorporated by Snyder. Barbados leading into death metal. Snyder built up on what Morrison had created with Batman, and all that was related to Silver Age adventures that Batman experienced. All of this is linked, and so that's a compliment to Morrison. And it's a discussion for another day when we talk about the difference between what works and what doesn't when you read history. Bendis says he's read a lot of DC history, but he's not incorporated it very well at all. He's ignored all of it. He's read this DC history to destroy it. Morrison read DC history and incorporated it. There's a very big difference.
Yeah, and the thing is, even if you want to call Morrison's work dense, I mean, again, I guess we'll continue on his Batman. I still feel like you could have jumped in at the beginning of any one of those arcs and been fine. Truly. I
would disagree with you there. Respectfully, I think that was too. I agree with him that it's dense. It's a challenging read. It challenges the reader. Dark Knight. I would submit that you were up to the task, but I think it was a challenging read myself.
See, I don't know, because I think, having all those questions kind of made me excited to go and explore it. And mind you, I wasn't a reader. I was convinced at the time that I hated reading. Truly, I was convinced that I hated reading.
Yeah.
And I remember going into it, and I think I read I read Final Crisis, and then I went back to Batman and Rest in Peace. And then I remember reading that story. I'm like, first of all, this is crazy cool by just in the way that Grant Morrison explored the psychology of Batman. But also I'm like, holy shit, how did Joker get a bullet in his head? I remember oh my God, this is nuts. This Joker is so different from anything I've ever seen, but I love it. And so then I was like, oh, I want to go back and explore. So then I went back to the beginning, and read that issue where the imposter Batman shot him in the head. And we incorporate Damian. And even only at the time having a very superficial knowledge of Batman and the Bat family, I was like, oh, this is a totally cool new dynamic. And I don't know. I guess those things kind of stoked the flames for me. So I think that's why I am very active in defending Grant Morrison's dense writing, because I think it provides a level of intrigue generally. And I think his approach is very, very unique in that way. But I don't want to, turn this into the Grant Morrison podcast. I think that maybe it might be easier, especially, because I know, Jace, you've been reading comics for a long time. I know, Boom, you've been reading comics for a long time. And I think that, you're obviously going to have your own interpretation as to how a new fan is going to approach all of this stuff, right? That, okay, maybe I only understood this or liked this because I read this.
Yeah. Well, let me defend you for a second, Dark Knight. I mean, I started reading comic books. I started reading comic books with Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes in the middle of a story arc that was convoluted and crazy, and I loved it. And I had a passion for it, and it never occurred to me to be upset because I never understood. I considered it a challenge. When I read something, I was fascinated by it. It's like it'd be like watching pick the 23 Marvel movies. You watch the 13th Marvel movie, you're going to want to watch the 12 before, right? I mean, you get excited about it. And that's what it was for me for comics. And we can never all of us in the chat and yourself and myself, we can't fault each other. We never know what drives our passion, what gets us excited about comics. That's what makes comic books so great is, you get all these different writers, and it just goes to show you that, look, I think Grant Morrison can be confusing, but guess what? There's a reason why he's considered one of the best writers in comic books.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously there's something about his writing that captures the imagination of people. And that's why I always say, and I say this as hard as I can be on the writers like King and Bendis and Morrison. Guess what? They've also written some of the best comic book stories I have ever read. And so, you know what? I'm always mindful that for every time I'm pointing a finger, I've got 3 pointing back at me saying, hey, these guys are also legends, and there's a reason why they can't, they're writing hundreds of stories a year, or write whatever, I don't know, hundreds of comics a year. They can't always hit it out of the park, but it's always a double-edged sword.
Yeah, I think the frustrating thing for me is when it comes to guys like Bendis. Like I just bought his first Daredevil omnibus, and the issue is that it becomes apparent that he's not taking the same approach to storytelling, and he's not doing it with the same love and the same passion as he did back when, he was crafting these stories and these narratives that, just pulled me in by the neck.
Yeah.
And it's frustrating. And I think it's very frustrating the more you become aware of it, because you can tell that it's not this creator just really swinging for the fences. It's not this creator going, I built myself a name. Maybe now I can try the more experimental ideas that have been kind of cooking in my head for a long time, and really give it a go and really do something that I think will impact the character in the best way possible. And if it fails, it fails. But I think that there's definitely a very apparent atmosphere in how he's creating these stories, and they're not out of passion, and they're not genuine things that he feel like will move the character forward. It just feels like he wants to make these big changes, and then people can say, oh, that was a Bendis thing. Mm-hmm. That he wants his name on a Legion of Superheroes book, so that when people discuss Legion of Superheroes, his name is up there with the Paul Levitts, and so on and so forth. Or when he's discussed on Superman, he'll be discussed with some of the greats because he was on Superman.
It won't be.
It won't be. But I think that's what he's trying to do, and he's trying to surprise people and do things of that nature. And I think the reason why people aren't reacting to it is A, because they're bad, but B, I can't respect it because I can tell that he's not taking a careful approach. He's not doing it out of love or a desire to make an impact that he feels fits. So I think that's the big issue. I can acknowledge when writers that I really like swing for the fences, but just don't create something that I like. For example, I liked the beginning of Grant Morrison's Green Lantern. I after from the
I did too. It was really well done.
But honestly, from the Hard Traveling Heroes issue on, when he links up with Ollie, I was like, I don't think this is for me anymore. I mean, I'm still going to kind of read through as much of it as I can, but even then I can acknowledge he's really trying to do something that he feels is going to be important for this character. And it doesn't connect with me. And I didn't like the issue, nor did I really understand the issue with Hal and Ollie, but I can acknowledge that Grant Morrison is clearly doing what he thinks to be the right thing. And I can respect that. I can totally respect that. And you know what? A couple years down the line, when somebody else is writing Green Lantern and I'm loving it, I don't even have to think about it. I think at the very least, like I said, I can appreciate that whatever he's doing feels genuine. It feels like he's really trying to do something that he thinks will add to this character. And so, that's a big difference.
Well, at the end of the day, we have Reboot versus Retcon. And as I see it, at the end of the day, it all comes down to the stories. And the best stories, if you have a good story, and if it's really good, It doesn't matter whether it's in the spirit of a reboot or a retcon, people are going to remember it. And that ultimately is what it's all about, because the best stories become part of continuity. I think that is the one consistent thing, whether you're at Marvel or DC or Valiant or whatever, the best stories become part of the continuity. And I guess it really comes down to, having that connection with the fans and making the right editorial and publishing decisions. And that, let's face it, right now we got CB Sabulski, and Jim Lee making decisions at DC Comics. And God, we live in interesting times, my friend. And Dark Knight, I have to say, I've loved this discussion with you once again. We've illuminated the troglodyte masses as to the problems of the comic book publishing industry. And once again, we've solved the problems. If only more people would watch our live streams, all would be well.
Yes. That's very simple. We erect our armies. We storm the gates of DC Comics. We demand executive positions. And we take them.
That's
and then
right.
We change the DC universe.
Yeah.
And everybody in this live stream, they'll be subsectional generals of our army, and we move from there and dominate the industry. And I think just to summarize everything, is that it seems like the both of us are on a consensus where it feels like retcons can do all of the positive things that a reboot can without taking a step over the line in the sand.
Yeah.
They can do it without going too far. And the thing is that reboots, although they can have a truly functional purpose to them, ultimately are a double-edged sword. And at least with retcons, you can affect that change. You can consolidate, clean up continuity. You can reestablish things for the modern age without devaluing anything else. And I think you said it as eloquently as anybody's going to say it. It's about the story. It's about the characters. Ultimately, and it is for all these conversations that we've had over the last month or so, the ultimate solution is getting creators and editors in there that are not only talented at what they do and at their craft, but love the characters, love the universe, and have a sense of direction for them. That's the most important thing. Fans, they have to be fans of the industry and of these characters. And it is a difficult balance, as we're up here getting passionate and me yelling into my computer. It's not an easy job.
No, it's not.
It's really not, because we're over here being the peanut gallery. But at the end of the day, all we want is for them to succeed. We get mad at the Bendises and the Kings and DC Comics because they've created pure magnificence before, and that's what we want to see from them. Not only because we're selfish and we want stories to enjoy, but because we know that they're capable of doing it. And I think that's what makes it frustrating, right? Like ultimately, it's from a point of passion. And I think that's important. It's really important for the fandom to acknowledge that. Because I think a lot of people can get really, really aggressive on these creators. And you know what? You can be mad. I've been mad before.
Yes, you have.
And we've done our little rants, but at the end of the day, we have these discussions, and really boiling it down is because we care, and we have to reevaluate that. And ultimately, we need to get people in there that care. So, Marvel, hire me 2020. But as we're closing out, I really want to thank everybody that's participated in the chat. We got Tevye Smoka, Telhelm29, Nerdy Blurb TV, Jace Millum, Solo Rebirth.
That was
Maverick MX, and somebody new joining us, Aggressively Relaxing. I love that name.
And Nerdy Blurb popped by too. So
yep. I do want to put a little thing. I really love Aggressively Relaxing. I think that's a great name. But yeah, so I really want to thank everybody for sitting down and engaging in opening up this discussion and being respectful about it. I think one of the great things is that everybody is going to interpret this world and these characters and their legacies very differently. based on when they're coming into it, and based on, you know, a number of different things. And it's important to have these conversations. You know, Boom and I, we really only agree half the time. You know, we've had some very, very strong-handed discussions, disagreeing with each other, and I think that's really important, because I think there have been a number of occasions where Boom has made me realize things that I didn't before, and I feel like I've done the same, and it opens up kind of new avenues of thought. So, Boom, as always, I want to thank you for sitting down and talking comics, and, you know, engaging in conversation about the things that we both love.
Right.
And again, thank you so much to everybody who's watching. If for some reason you're not, click the link in the description below to subscribe to Comic Boom. He is the guy. Obviously, my partner in crime. We are the dynamic duo. So you can't be sitting here watching me if you're not going to go watch him, and I'll die on that hill. You have any particular reviews coming up in the near future, my friend?
Well, I might just cram out a bunch of reviews. There's a lot. Oh my God. You know, you've criticized me before politely by suggesting that I should stop reviewing comic books that I detest, and and it's like, well, you know what? I mean, when I'm on a roll, like, I'll probably review Batman. I'm enjoying Tinian's Batman. I don't detest that. I really enjoy Tinian's Batman. Full disclosure, I really quite enjoy that. Aside from the speculator hype of Punchline, I really enjoy the designer storyline. I think it's got a lot of potential. I really like the story idea. It seems almost one-dimensional on the surface, yet I don't think it's really been explored enough in Batman. The idea of this character designer sort of taking the heroes and taking the villains, I mean, and taking them to their fullest potential and training them, and yet he supposedly died, but now he's come back. And I think that's a really good idea. I think Tinian's done a really good job there. I love the storyline. It's original, and in any event, but with Bendis, I've always reviewed Superman and Supergirl, but the storylines are so bad. They're so badly written that, you know, my incentive to review them. I mean, I know I sound like a broken record sometimes, but I don't want to sound like a negative Nelly on my reviews all the time. And I realized that I've been getting that way on my reviews, and it's kind of bothering me a bit if I'm if I'm sharing too much information on this live stream. That's it. I'm having a little bit of a crisis of conscience in terms of, you know, it's just like I'm not really feeling the passion to do the review some of these, because I really think Bendis is doing a demonstrably terrible job with not so much the Legion of Superheroes. I'm more forgiving on that. I think it's got potential there. But because I'm a lover of the Legion, and I do think he's got some good ideas, but Superman, no, doesn't. His Young Justice is awful. His Superman is awful. His Leviathan ideas are awful. They're all awful. And he even, Bendis tweeted recently about, you know, Rucka's Lois Lane and Matt Fraction's Jimmy Olsen tying into Superman. Again, why would anybody want that? Awful. It's just that none of these storylines are really working. And it's a really low point in Superman right now, and it's just not working. But anyways, you asked me what I'm doing, and I get all depressed.
No, it's all good, man. I mean, you know, you have a point, and just quickly touching on that, I think it's just that Bendis has totally lost touch with comic book readers, because, you know, that statement was him trying to reassure us that Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen, those stories matter because they're impacting the Superman book or that main story. That's not what makes them matter. Making good stories is what makes them matter. Yeah. You should be reassuring me that these creators are crafting good stories. I don't care if they tie in with Superman. I care if they're good stories. And that I think is ultimately highlighting why Bendis hasn't put out a good comic book in a couple of years. Yeah, because he thinks that just because something has an impact means it's important, and that's not the case.
But I feel now's a good time for me to state categorically something that I don't think I've necessarily made very clear in my videos, my reviews, and that is that I fundamentally don't like Superman as interpreted by Brian Bendis. I view him as an unlikable, pathetic, indecisive loser. And I mean that in every sense of the term, and I mean that sincerely. He's not a man. He's not someone that's worthy of the mantle of Superman. And what is so disappointing is that now that Superman has revealed that he's Clark Kent, I don't know if you've noticed this, but just if you want to waste $3.99 American, pick up a Superman comic lately, and you'll discover that guess what? Superman was always the loser known as Clark Kent. Clark Kent was never Superman. The primary defining identity of Superman has been the beta male, has been the loser, has been Clark Kent. Superman is insecure, pathetic, lowly, doesn't question his wife, lets her make all the decisions, blah, 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 blah. He stands for nothing. And when you stand for nothing, and when you let others define you, whether it's your wife or your best friend Jimmy Olsen, I mean, can you imagine letting Jimmy Olsen, this doughhead idiot kid who's still living in the 60s, define who you are? This is what Bendis is doing, and it's pathetic and it's disgraceful. And Superman is not standing up for. He's even letting his son define the future. What does Superman stand for himself? That's what Bendis has utterly failed to do. What does Superman stand for? He stands for nothing. Everybody that he surrounds himself with defines who he is. And that's why Bendis' Superman fails.
Yeah, I think you summed it up. I mean, there's a reason I stopped buying the book after like issue 5.
Yeah.
You know, you speak with your dollar. And so that's how I decided to speak. You know, you were like, I don't know. You said, you know, if you want to waste $4 American.
Yeah.
I decided to stop wasting my $4 American by issue 5. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a whole nother topic. You know,
it is. It really is.
Of Superman in modern.
That'll be next week.
You heard it here, folks. I guess that may have to be a topic of conversation. Reassessing the interpretation of Superman for the modern age by Bendis. I don't know. We'll develop it. We'll enter the think chamber and get that rolling. But you know, end of the day, I want to thank everybody for watching us live. I really appreciate you guys participating in the conversation. If you guys enjoy the video, please make sure to leave a like. That way we can get more people in on these conversations. We can kiss the YouTube algorithm's ass, basically, so that we can build this community of just level-headed comic book fans that want to talk about the things they love and why they're important, because that's important. So I want to thank you guys. Boom. As always, man, it is always a pleasure to sit down and chat with you. One of the highlights of the week, as always. So make sure you guys.
Thanks.
What's up, brother?
I said good to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. Make sure you guys go subscribe to his channel down below to keep in the loop with everything Comic Boom. You can follow us both on Twitter at DarkKnightNat25 and at Metropolis40 to keep up with our other antics. And again, make sure you guys are keeping an eye out because we're going to be discussing something on Comic Boom's channel in the very near future. So thank you guys so much for watching. And this is Dark Knight Nation and Comic Boom signing out.